Eleanor Brooks stood by the living room window, her pale hands gripping a steaming cup of black tea. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting sharp lines across her face, etched deeply by time. At 61, Eleanor had learned to live with silence. A silence she told herself was safe, was proper. Her small suburban home on the outskirts of Chicago was always spotless, not a speck of dust in sight, but it also lacked the warmth of life. There was no laughter, no footsteps, only the ticking of the wall clock, a constant reminder that time continued, even if she no longer participated in its flow. Outside the window, the neighborhood was waking up. Joggers passed by with glinting earbuds. Young mothers pushed strollers, their smiles radiant, and couples walked hand in hand, as if they had just discovered the secret to happiness. Eleanor watched them all with a cold stare and tight lips. She didn't hate them, at least, not the loud public hatred that made headlines. No, her judgment was subtler, honed over decades like an heirloom carefully polished. In her mind, everyone should stay in their place. White with white, black with black. She believed that was the natural order and saw no reason for it to change. Today, one couple caught her eye. A black man and a white woman walking hand in hand with a fluffy dog in tow. Their laughter echoed down the quiet street. Eleanor nodded and muttered, "Why does everyone want to mix everything up nowadays?" Her voice was soft but sharp as a blade slicing through the room's stillness. She sipped tea. The bitterness sliding down her throat did nothing to ease the growing discomfort. She thought love was for young girls in spring dresses with smooth skin and eyes full of hope. Not for someone like her, a woman who had lived more than half a century with wrinkles and a heart sealed shut. And certainly not with someone of another race. The thought made her cross her arms, as if to shield herself from her ideas. Eleanor's home was a fortress, not just physically, but spiritually. She had built invisible walls separating her from the outside world. She didn't attend neighborhood gatherings, avoided community events, and rarely answered her phone. Her remaining friends like Susan understood her, or at least agreed with her. Together, they shared familiar refrains. The world's gone mad. Nothing's like it used to be. These words comforted Eleanor and proved that she wasn't alone in how she saw the world. But today, as she stood there watching the couple, a strange feeling arose. Not anger, not contempt, but an emptiness, a hollow she couldn't name. She turned away from the window and set the cup on the table. The oak table gleamed without a scratch, but bore no traces of shared meals or lively conversation. She lived alone, and she told herself that was her choice. Her husband George had passed away 10 years ago, and their children had grown and moved to faraway cities. They rarely called, and Eleanor didn't blame them. She had raised them to be independent, just as her father had raised her. But now that independence felt more like a punishment. Her phone lay still on the shelf, its screen black. No one called, no one visited. She had once thought loneliness was strength, a testament to her resolve. But now it only made her feel like she was standing in a room without doors. Eleanor walked over to the bookshelf where she kept an old family photo. In the picture, she was young, standing beside her parents with a stiff smile. Her father, a stern man with cold eyes, had always taught her that the world was divided into us and them. Them were those who didn't look like her and didn't share her skin color or values. Those lessons had been etched into her mind, forming the foundation of her life. She remembered how her father used to sneer at interracial families on TV, his voice full of disdain. "They're ruining everything." She had nodded, never questioning. But now as she looked at the photo, another memory flashed, small but vivid. A black boy in elementary school who once gave her a wildflower. She had smiled, but her father had pulled her away, his hand tightening on her wrist. "Don't go near them," he had said. She hadn't understood why, but she obeyed. She set the photo down, her heart heavy. The phone rang, shattering the silence. It was Susan. Her familiar voice came through the speaker. "Elle, have you seen the news? Another mess. I told you this world's going downhill." Eleanor let out a dry chuckle, agreeing reflexively. "You're right, Susan. Thank goodness we still have some sense left." But when the call ended, her smile faded. Susan's words, once comforting, now echoed hollow. She looked out the window again. The couple had disappeared, but their image lingered like a question she didn't want to answer. She told herself she didn't need anyone, didn't need the world out there. But deep down, a small crack had formed in the wall she had spent her whole life building. Eleanor Brooks sat in the old armchair in her living room, the soft yellow light from the table lamp highlighting the wrinkles on her face. The room was silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the sound of wind slipping through the window crack. The family photo on the bookshelf seemed to gaze back at her, her father Henry's stern eyes piercing through time. She picked up the photo, her fingers gliding over the worn wooden frame, her heart heavy. Her father had been a man of order, of unyielding rules. "The world is only safe when everyone knows their place," he used to say, his voice deep and firm, as if stating the one true law. Eleanor, then just a little girl with wide eyes, had nodded solemnly, engraving those words into her young mind. She set the photo down, her eyes scanning the room. Everything was in its place. The blue upholstered sofa spotless, the bookshelf alphabetically arranged, and the oak table gleaming as if freshly polished. But that perfection no longer brought her pride unlike it used to. Now it only reminded her that she was living in a cage of her own making, reinforced by her father's teachings. Henry never spoke openly of hate, but he had a way of turning difference into a threat. Warnings always accompanied family dinners. "Don't let them get close, Eleanor. They're not like us. They'll destroy everything we have." They were black people, immigrants, and anyone who didn't belong in his version of the world, a world he believed was pure and right. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to silence his voice. But another memory surged, sharp and vivid, as if it had happened just yesterday. 10-year-old Eleanor stood on the elementary school playground, her dress rumpled after recess. A black boy named Tommy approached her holding a small yellow wildflower. "This is for you," he said, his smile bright as sunshine. Eleanor took the flower, her heart fluttering. She had never thought about Tommy's skin color. He was just a friend who made her laugh. But then her father appeared, his eyes cold as steel. He grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight, and pulled her away. "Don't go near that boy," he growled. "You're not allowed." Eleanor glanced back and saw Tommy standing there. The flower dropped. She didn't understand why, but Tommy's disappointed eyes carved a scar into her that she never dared to touch. She opened her eyes. Her breath labored. That memory, buried for many years now, rose like a haunting reminder. She had once been an open, curious child, ready to smile at anyone. What had changed? She looked down at her hands, bony fingers etched with the marks of time. She had allowed her father's lessons to shape her, to turn her into a woman who lived behind invisible walls, judging the world through the lens of fear and division. But today, the image of the interracial couple outside the window, their laughter had shaken her. They weren't afraid, weren't closed off. They were living, truly living, while she was merely existing. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The screen lit up with the name Susan, the only close friend she still kept in contact with. Eleanor put it on speaker. Susan's voice rang out sharp and familiar. "Elle, did you see the news? Another mess downtown. I told you this world's falling apart. People keep mixing everything up, and for what? Nothing good comes of it. Eleanor gave a dry chuckle, an automatic response. You're right, Susan. Thank goodness we still have our heads on straight. But even as she said it, the words sounded hollow, like lines from an old script. Susan continued, her voice dripping with disdain. Did you see that couple out on the street, black and white, acting like they want everyone to see them? I just don't get it. Eleanor glanced out the window where the couple had disappeared. She opened her mouth to agree, but her throat tightened. For the first time, she didn't want to repeat those familiar lines. Elle, are you okay? Susan asked, suspicion in her voice. Yeah, I'm fine, Eleanor replied, but her tone lacked life. She hung up and set the phone down, feeling like she had laid down a burden. Susan's words, once a source of comfort, now sounded like noise, just more walls she had leaned on for too long. She stood and walked to the window, gazing at the empty street. The couple was gone, but their laughter echoed in her mind like an invitation she didn't dare accept. She told herself she didn't need to change, that her world was still fine, still safe. But deep down, the memory of Tommy and the wildflower whispered that she had once been someone else, and perhaps she could be again. She returned to the armchair and sat down, her hand clutching the family photo. Her father had taught her how to fear, but he hadn't taught her how to face emptiness. She looked into his eyes in the picture, and for the first time, she didn't see certainty. She saw a man imprisoned by his own beliefs. She turned the photo face down, no longer wanting to confront it. The clock kept ticking, but it didn't just mark the passage of time this time. It reminded her that she still had time to ask questions, change, and live. But did she have the courage to step beyond the wall she had spent a lifetime building? She didn't know. Yet the small crack forming in her mind, stirred by the couple by Tommy, was growing, and she could no longer ignore it. Eleanor Brooks pushed open the glass doors of the community library, holding tightly onto a cardboard box filled with canned soup and beans. The October wind in Chicago blew through, bitter and sharp, making her regret not bringing gloves. She didn't want to be here or attend this so-called food drive. But last week, after a trip to the grocery store, she had bought far too many canned goods, and the thought of throwing them away made her feel guilty. So here she was, stepping into a space full of unfamiliar faces, lively voices, and an overwhelming sense of not belonging. To Eleanor, events like this were just performances by people eager to flaunt their goodness, or worse, attempts to pressure her into integrating into a world she had deliberately chosen to stay out of. She climbed the stairs to the main hall, the box heavier than expected. With each step, it slipped a little further in her arms, the cans inside clanking as if mocking her. She gritted her teeth and tightened her grip, but by the fifth step, the box tilted dangerously. Need a hand. A warm, deep voice called from behind. Eleanor turned, breath short. A few steps away was a black man, probably in his early 40s, wearing a neat gray sweater and dark jeans. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but his eyes caught her attention, calm, bright, as though he could see through her without even trying. He smiled gently, not showy, just enough to be kind. I can manage, Eleanor replied, her voice sharper than intended. She clutched the box tighter, forcing out a polite smile that felt stiff like a mask. Thank you. The man nodded without offense. All right, he said, stepping back, his hands sliding into his pockets as if he'd never spoken. No insistence, no judgmental gaze, just a calmness that threw her off balance. She turned away and walked faster, as if fleeing that moment. Her breath quickened as she reached the top of the stairs, not from exertion, but from the strange feeling swelling in her chest. She set the box on the intake table inside the hall, avoiding looking back. A young volunteer with a name tag read, Clara, beamed at her. Thank you so much. Would you like a receipt? Eleanor shook her head. No, thank you. She turned around, stealing a glance through the glass door. The man was still there, helping an elderly white-haired woman into her car. He bent down, listening to her say something, then laughed a genuine laugh, not forced. Eleanor frowned, wondering why she cared. She didn't know him and didn't want to. But something about him, his calm, unassuming kindness, made her feel exposed, as though he had unintentionally touched a part she had kept buried. She left the library, stepping onto a sidewalk, strewn with fallen golden leaves. The wind was colder now, but she didn't feel it. Her mind circled back to that stairwell moment. She had refused his help, not because she genuinely wanted to do it alone, but because of a deep-rooted reflex. A voice from the past that echoed in her mind. Don't let them get close. Her father's voice. Henry was still sharp after all these years, but that man had done nothing wrong. He didn't push, didn't seem bothered. He had offered, then stepped back. So why did it unsettle her so much? She walked faster, as if she could leave the feeling behind. Back home, Eleanor stood in the kitchen, turning on the tap to wash her hands. Cold water flowed over her thin fingers, but she barely felt it. She stared into the sink, her mind still caught in that brief encounter. She couldn't forget his voice, deep and steady, without a trace of threat. She couldn't forget his eyes, not judging, simply present. Something about him made her feel like she had done something wrong, though she couldn't quite say what. She dried her hands on a towel, her movements slow, as if trying to wipe the memory away. Just a stranger, she murmured, her voice so soft she barely heard it herself. Nothing to worry about. But as she sat back in her familiar armchair, her gaze drifted again to the face-down family photo on the bookshelf. The memory of Tommy, the boy with the wildflower, flickered through her mind. This time she didn't push it away. She thought about how she had refused the man today, just as her father had pulled her away from Tommy. She told herself it was just a reflex, a way to protect herself. But deep down a question began. What would have happened if she hadn't refused? If she had smiled, said thank you, and let him help? She shook her head, trying to banish the thought. She didn't need to change. She didn't need him or anyone. But as she looked out the window at the empty street bathed in sunset light, she couldn't deny that the moment had left a mark, a new crack in the wall she had spent her whole life building. Eleanor Brooks stepped into the community center's main hall, her low-heeled shoes tapping softly on the polished wooden floor. Today's community luncheon, with its speeches and polite handshakes, was not where she wanted to be. But her sister Margaret had called the week before, her voice full of encouragement. "Elle, get out a bit. It's just a lunch. No one's forcing you to talk." Eleanor had reluctantly agreed, not because she wanted to socialize, but because she couldn't find a good excuse that didn't leave her feeling guilty. She adjusted her gray scarf and walked with the confidence honed over decades, a confidence that masked deep-seated unease. The hall was warmly decorated, round tables, draped in white cloths, small flower vases at the center, and a long table near the entrance lined with name tags. Eleanor glanced at them, but didn't stop. She disliked labels and the idea that a small slip of paper could define her. She found a quiet corner near a window, hoping to observe in peace without being drawn into meaningless conversation. But her eyes unexpectedly caught a familiar figure near the speaker's podium. The tall man wearing a navy blazer over a white shirt flipped through a folder. She squinted and recognized him, the black man who had offered to help her at the food drive the week before. She didn't know his name, but the memory of his calm eyes and warm voice still unsettled her. Without much thought, Eleanor walked over, her tone sharp and assured, as though addressing an obvious problem. "Excuse me," she said, standing a few steps away. "They must clear the front area before the event starts. The logistics team is meeting out back. You could help them." She smiled, a polite but cold smile, the kind she used when she wanted to maintain distance. The man looked up, his eyes bright and composed, meeting hers. He closed the folder slowly and replied, his voice gentle yet precise. I'm not with the logistics team. I'm today's speaker. Time stopped. Heat rushed to Eleanor's face, burning. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She heard soft murmurs from nearby and felt the weight of eyes turning toward her. An older woman at the nearest table stopped mid-bite, her fork frozen in the air. A middle-aged man gave a discreet cough, as if trying to break the awkward silence. But the man in front of her, James, as she would later learn, nodded, showing no anger or smugness. He stepped aside and resumed reviewing his notes as though nothing had happened. Instead of soothing her embarrassment, his calmness only made it sting more sharply. Eleanor turned away, her feet barely touching the ground, as she rushed to find a seat in the back row. She sat down, clutching the edge of the tablecloth, her heart pounding. She tried to focus on meaningless details, the pattern on the tablecloth, the clinking of cutlery, but her mind was trapped in that moment. She had assumed he was a janitor or setup staff, not based on any real indication, but because of his skin color and the lessons her father had drilled into her mind. They don't belong in places like this. She told herself he should have worn a name tag and should have introduced himself. But deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't asked, hadn't thought, she had judged. The luncheon began, but Eleanor heard nothing. The speaker, James, took the stage, his voice deep and engaging, speaking about building community through small acts. She couldn't look at him or bear the thought that he knew what she had assumed about him. She stared down at the wilted lettuce on her salad plate, feeling withering. When the room erupted in applause, she bent down to pick up her napkin to avoid meeting his eyes. She wanted to leave, but her feet felt glued to the floor. Her shame didn't just stem from her mistake. It came from having that mistake laid bare in front of strangers and herself. When the luncheon ended, Eleanor was among the first to leave. She stepped outside the crisp October air of Chicago, slapping her face. But it didn't cool the storm within. She walked home instead of driving, as if the walk might serve as penance. The image of James standing there, neither angry nor accusatory, kept looping in her mind. He hadn't needed to say anything. The truth had already done enough to make her feel small. She thought of Tommy, the boy with the wildflower, and how her father had shaped her into someone who judged without cause. She thought of the interracial couple outside her window, and how she had scorned them without knowing a thing about them. Back home, Eleanor stood in the hallway facing the mirror, staring into her tired eyes. "You were wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. For the first time, she didn't try to justify it, didn't try to blame someone else. She thought of James, of how he hadn't needed to correct her, because the truth had done it for him. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but she knew this moment would not leave her. It was another larger crack in the wall she had built all her life, and this time, she wasn't sure she wanted to fix it. Eleanor Brooks sat alone in the kitchen, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting her shadow onto the white wall. Night had fallen over Chicago, the cold October air creeping in through the window crack. But she didn't feel the chill. In front of her sat a cup of cold coffee, the metal spoon inside unmoved for quite some time. She stared at the oak table, its swirling grain patterns drawing her deeper into a maze of thoughts. The image of James Carter, his calm eyes and gentle voice, "I'm today's speaker," played over and over in her mind, vivid and inescapable. The shame from the luncheon wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a slow-burning fire consuming the outer shell she had spent years constructing. She closed her eyes, trying to reclaim her home's familiar peace and old routines. But the silence, once her refuge, had become a mirror reflecting everything she didn't want to see. She had been wrong not just today, but for most of her life. She had made assumptions about James, not because of anything he did, but because of the color of his skin, because of the lessons her father Henry had etched into her mind when she was just a girl. "They're not like us," he'd said, his voice deep and resolute. as if reciting an unwritten law. They don't belong in places like this. Eleanor had nodded then, unquestioning, unthinking. She had carried those words with her, turning them into a compass and justification for keeping her distance from the world. But now, sitting in the dark, she couldn't escape the truth. She thought of Tommy, the black boy, with the wildflower, and his disappointed eyes when her father had yanked her away. That memory, buried for over 50 years, rose like an accusation. She remembered another time at 25, working at a small bookstore downtown. A black co-worker, Anita, had invited her for coffee after a shift. "It's just coffee," Anita had said, with a warm smile. But Eleanor had declined, claiming she was busy, even though she'd only gone home to sit alone. She'd told herself she wasn't comfortable, that it was the safer choice. But now she knew it hadn't been discomfort. It had been prejudice. Fear. A fear planted by her father and nurtured through years of avoidance, years of keeping herself apart from anyone unlike her. She stood and walked to the sink, turning on the faucet. Cold water ran over her hands, but couldn't wash away the heaviness inside. She thought about all the times she had changed the channel when the news spoke of racial injustice, the times she pursed her lips at the sight of interracial couples, the times she murmured with Susan about how chaotic the world had become. Each moment, she realized, was another brick in the wall she had built around herself. She once believed that the wall kept her safe, but now she sees it only imprisoning her, holding her from the world, from people like Tommy, Anita, and James. She turned off the water and dried her hands with a towel. Her movements slowed, as if clinging to some shred of control. She returned to the table and sat down again, her gaze unconsciously drifting to the family photo on the bookshelf. She stood, picked up the frame, but didn't turn it over. She didn't want to look into her father's eyes or face the man who had taught her that difference meant danger. But she couldn't deny that he was a part of her, that his lessons had shaped the woman sitting here now, alone with shame and emptiness. She set the photo down, her hand trembling slightly. "You were wrong," she whispered, her voice cracking in the dark. The words weren't for her father. They weren't for James. They were for herself. She thought of James, how he hadn't been angry, hadn't scolded, had spoken the truth and walked away. His calm wasn't forgiveness. It was a mirror forcing her to look at herself. She wondered what he thought of her, an older woman with a cold smile and deeply mistaken assumptions. She asked whether he pitied her or didn't think she was worth the trouble. The thought stung, not because of his judgment, but because she had judged herself. She had spent a lifetime believing she understood the world, that she knew who belonged where. But now she saw the one who didn't belong might have been her, not just at the luncheon, but in her own life. She looked out the window. The street outside was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a street lamp. She thought of the interracial couple she once looked down on, their laughter and how they lived without walls. She thought of Tommy, the wildflower, Anita, and the coffee she had declined. Each memory was a crack, and now they were connecting, shaking the foundation of the wall she had relied on for too long. She didn't know what to do next, whether she could change, or if it was too late. But for the first time, she didn't want to run from the truth. She tried to face it, no matter how painful it might be. She sat back down, her hands gripping the cold coffee cup. The ticking clock echoed in the room, but this time it didn't just mark the passage of time. It reminded her that she still had time to understand, make things right, and live differently. But did she have the courage to move past the shame, past her father's lessons, past herself? She didn't know. But admitting you were wrong was a small but real beginning, like a faint light flickering in the dark. Eleanor Brooks sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, her breath forming faint clouds in the cold October air of Chicago. This morning she had planned to drive to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, but her old sedan refused to start. She turned the key again, only to hear a hopeless click. She tapped the steering wheel gently, muttering, "Don't do this to me, not today." She looked at the nearly empty post office parking lot and felt a rare wave of helplessness. Her gloves were in the trunk. Her phone was about to die, and she was already 15 minutes late. She sighed and prepared to step out and check the engine, even though she had no idea what she was looking for. Having trouble. A deep, familiar voice made her start. Eleanor turned her head, and through the fogged-up window she saw a tall figure standing a few steps away. It was James Carter, the black man she had met at the food drive and again at the community luncheon. He wore a dark coat and a navy blue scarf and held a steaming cup of coffee. His eyes were still calm and bright, but this time Eleanor felt the shame rise inside her. The memory of mistaking him for the cleanup staff at the luncheon was still fresh like an unhealed wound. She wondered if he remembered if he was looking at her with the contempt she thought she deserved. Maybe the battery, she said, her voice quieter than she intended, trying to sound composed. Or the starter. I'm not sure. She opened the door and stepped out, avoiding his gaze. James nodded and set his coffee cup on the hood of a nearby car. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, his voice offering but not pressing. Eleanor hesitated. Her old instincts told her to decline to keep her distance. But she was tired, and her frustration with the broken car made her nod. "If you don't mind," she said. James walked to the front of her car and popped the hood with practiced ease. She stood a few steps away, arms crossed like an outsider. He pulled a pair of gloves from his coat pocket and slipped them on. "I always carry gloves," he said, as if speaking to an old acquaintance. "Got stuck in the snow in Wisconsin a few years back. Learned to be prepared after that." Eleanor was surprised by the personal detail, but only gave a slight nod, unsure how to respond. She watched him work his movements, quick but unhurried, as if helping a stranger was the most natural thing in the world. James returned to his car and retrieved a pair of jumper cables from the trunk. "I'll jump it from my car," he said, already connecting the cables before she could reply. As he worked, he added, his voice steady. "My mom was a nurse. She always kept a first aid kit and jumper cables in her car. She said, 'You never know when someone might need help.'" Eleanor felt a sudden curiosity, a desire to ask more about his mother, but she held back. She wasn't used to talking like this, not used to letting someone into her world, even through a few passing remarks. Within minutes, her engine coughed, then rumbled to life. James looked up and wiped his hands on his gloves. "Run it for about 15 minutes to recharge," he said, "but you'll probably want to replace the battery soon." Eleanor glanced at the dashboard, the headlights illuminating her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice more sincere than expected. "Really? Thank you." James nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "Take care, Ms. Brooks." He picked up his coffee, returned to his car, and drove away without looking back. Eleanor sat in her car, hands still on the steering wheel, but she didn't immediately drive off. She looked at the now empty road ahead and felt a strange stirring inside. She had expected something from James, a reproach, a smug glance, a reminder of her mistake at the luncheon. But he had done nothing of the sort. He had helped as if it were the obvious thing to do, as if she weren't the woman who had once judged him. That unconditional and unshowy kindness made her feel relieved and heavy. Relieved that he bore no grudge, heavy because she realized she had expected the worst from him, simply because he was different from her. She drove home, the streetlights passing across her window, but her mind stayed in the parking lot. She thought of Tommy, the boy with the wildflower, and Anita, the colleague she had refused. She thought of James, and how he hadn't needed to prove anything to her yet. His presence had shaken her wall of prejudice. She wondered why he had helped her. Was he just a good person, or was there something more profound? She didn't know, But she knew that this moment, like seeing him at the library, like the mistake at the luncheon, had left a mark. It wasn't a total transformation, but a step another crack, making her wonder if she could live differently or if it was too late to try. Back home, Eleanor stood in the kitchen looking at the cold cup of coffee from the night before. She didn't turn on the light, letting the darkness wrap around her. She thought of what James had said about his mother, about being prepared, about kindness. She thought of her father, of the divisive lessons he had left behind. For the first time, she wondered if she could choose a different path, not her father's, but her own. She didn't have the answer, but James's kindness, like a gentle breeze, had passed through her wall, and she couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Eleanor Brooks stood in the kitchen, the pale October morning light slipping through the curtains, casting soft streaks across the oak table. She had just brewed a cup of black tea, steam rising gently, but she didn't drink it. Her mind was still spinning from what had happened the day before: the broken car, James Carter's unexpected appearance, and his act of kindness, free of judgment or reproach. She had stayed up nearly all night, thinking about how he had helped her, how she had braced herself for bitterness that never came. Like a breeze sweeping through the wall of her prejudice, that kindness left her unsettled and yearning for something new, something she hadn't yet dared to name. Her phone vibrated on the table, shattering the silence. The screen lit up with the name Susan, her friend of over 30 years, the voice that had always echoed Eleanor's complaints about the world. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the answer button. Part of her wanted to tell Susan about James, about how he had helped her for no reason, to understand this strange growing feeling inside her. But another, smaller, yet sharper part warned that Susan wouldn't understand. She took a deep breath and answered, putting the call on speaker. "Hi, Susan," she said, trying to keep her voice natural. "Elle, did you survive yesterday?" Susan laughed loudly, her tone laced with mockery. "I heard you almost got stranded at the post office with that junk car of yours." Eleanor frowned, wondering how the news had spread. "Yeah, my car broke down," she replied evenly. "But someone helped me." She paused, then continued as if testing herself. "A man. He fixed the car. James Carter, the speaker from last week's luncheon." She fell silent, waiting for Susan's reaction, her heart beating faster. After a second of silence, Susan burst out laughing, not joyfully, but with a sharp edge. "Wait, you mean that black guy you thought was the janitor?" Susan's voice dripped with derision. "Elle, you didn't let someone like that get the upper hand, did you? They always want something, you know. Fixing your car. He's got to be after something." Once familiar, like an old song. Susan's words had once comforted Eleanor, but today they felt like thorns digging into her, making her cross her arms as if to shield herself. "He didn't ask for anything," Eleanor said, her voice firmer than she felt. "He just helped and left. He didn't even mention what happened at the luncheon." Susan sighed, as if talking to a naive child. "Elle, wake up. They're always nice at first. Then when you let your guard down, they take advantage. Don't you see how this world works? They don't do anything without a reason." Susan's words, steeped in prejudice and suspicion, made Eleanor freeze. She opened her mouth to agree like always, but her throat tightened. She thought of James, his non-judgmental eyes, the way he'd let her keep her dignity, even though she hadn't earned it. "You're being too harsh, Susan," Eleanor said, her voice low but sharp, surprising even herself. "He didn't do anything wrong. You don't know him." Silence fell. A heavy silence, like someone taking offense. "Elle, are you defending him?" Susan's tone turned cold. "You know I'm right. They're always like that. Suppose you want to be naive, fine, but don't blame me when it all goes wrong." Eleanor gripped the edge of the table, her heart pounding. She wanted to argue, to tell Susan she was wrong, that she didn't understand. But the words caught in her throat, and Susan hung up, leaving behind a silence that echoed. Eleanor stood there staring out the window. The sunlight was brighter now, but it didn't warm her. She thought of Susan, the years they had spent complaining together, building a world view where all difference was seen as a threat. Susan's calls, her sarcasm, had once been Eleanor's way of affirming she was right and wasn't alone. But now they sounded like noise, like chains tying her to a version of herself she no longer wanted to be. She walked over to the radio on the shelf, which always played the outrage-filled news programs she and Susan used to agree with. She reached out and turned it off. The noise vanished, and the silence felt like freedom for the first time. She sat down, hands wrapped around the now cold tea. She thought of James, of his unprompted kindness. She thought of Tommy, the wildflower left on the ground. She thought of Anita, the coffee she had refused. Each memory was a reminder that she had chosen to live in fear and prejudice, because it was easier than facing the truth. But James's kindness and honesty at the luncheon showed her that she couldn't keep living this way. She didn't want to. The call with Susan had drawn a line in the sand a moment, where Eleanor realized she no longer needed someone else's agreement to feel safe. She looked out at the road beyond the window, where yellow leaves drifted slowly to the ground. She wondered if she could live differently and begin dismantling the wall she and people like Susan had built. She didn't have the answer, but the silence after turning off the radio after ending the call no longer scared her. It was a new space where she could begin to listen to herself instead of the voices of the past. She didn't know what the next step was, but she knew she was ready to take it out of the darkness of what she used to believe, even if it was just a small step. Eleanor Brooks stood in the living room, her hands trembling slightly as she rearranged the porcelain cups on the tea tray. The soft afternoon light of October filtered through the curtains, casting pale golden streaks across the wooden floor, but the air in the house remained heavy. It had taken her the entire week to gather the courage to reach out to James Carter, the black man she had misjudged not once, but twice at the food drive and the community luncheon. After the argument with Susan, after turning off the radio, Eleanor realized she could no longer hide. She needed to apologize, not to be forgiven, but to confront herself. She had found his number through the volunteer list at the library, and in a short, careful message invited him to her home that afternoon. He had agreed. And now the doorbell sound was imminent, like a test she wasn't sure she would pass. She adjusted the scarf draped over her shoulders and looked into the hallway mirror. Her eyes, still tired but brighter than they'd been weeks ago, reflected the stirrings of a change taking shape. She no longer wanted to be the woman who mistook James for a janitor, who rejected his help out of reflexive prejudice. But apology, she knew, wasn't just about words. It required her to expose mistakes she had spent a lifetime concealing. She took a deep breath, just as the doorbell rang, soft but clear. She opened the door, and there stood James, wearing a dark blue sweater, his eyes as calm as ever. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks," he said, smiling gently. "Thank you for inviting me." "Thank you for coming," Eleanor replied, her voice slightly shaky. She welcomed him into the living room, motioning toward the sofa. They sat across from each other, the tea tray between them, like a small barrier. She poured the tea, her hands still unsteady, making the cup clink softly against the saucer. James accepted it without comment, simply nodding in thanks. The silence that followed lasted a second, not tense, but significant, as if both knew this wasn't the time for small talk. Eleanor breathed, looking straight at him, though her heart pounded hard. "I want to apologize," she began, her voice low but steady, "for the luncheon, for how I treated you, and at the library too. I judged you, and I was wrong." James stirred his tea, his eyes cast downward, saying nothing yet. His silence wasn't rejection, it was space for her to continue. Eleanor swallowed hard, the words rising in her like a flood. "I was raised to see the difference as danger," she said, trembling slightly. "My father taught me that everyone should stay in their place, That skin color was a boundary. I lived my whole life believing that, never questioning it. So when I looked at you, I only saw what I had been taught, not who you were. And I'm sorry for that." James looked up, his gaze clear, free of judgment. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice deep and sincere, "it's not just one moment. It's the years that led to it. What you were taught, what you chose to believe, those shaped how you saw me, how you see others." He paused, setting the teacup down. "The hardest part isn't the apology. It's understanding why it happened and what you do with it afterward." His words weren't soft, but they weren't harsh either. They were like a mirror, forcing Eleanor to look deeper within. She nodded, her throat tight. "I know," she whispered. "I've been thinking about it a lot. About Tommy, a black boy I knew as a child. About Anita, a co-worker I once turned down out of fear. About how I've lived keeping my distance from anyone who wasn't like me. I'm not proud of that anymore." She paused, eyes on her clasped hands. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I want you to know I was wrong and want to change." James looked at her, taking his time. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softer but still clear. "Forgiveness isn't something I can give you, Ms. Brooks. It's something you have to live with. Change doesn't end with guilt. It begins when you act differently, seeing people not through your father's lens, but with your own eyes." He paused again, and his gaze softened. "You're starting. That's what matters." Silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was a new space where Eleanor felt seen, not as a woman filled with prejudice, but as someone trying. She thought of James, of how he didn't need to be here, didn't need to listen, but he came anyway. She wondered what made him that way. "Why did you help me?" she asked, quiet but curious. "After everything, why were you still kind?" James smiled faintly for the first time during the conversation. "My mother used to say, kindness isn't something you give to get something back. It's something you give because you believe people deserve it. I didn't help you to prove anything. I helped because you needed it, and because I could." He stood, picking up his cup. "Thank you for the tea and your honesty. Not everyone dares to say what you just did." Eleanor walked him to the door, feeling like a weight had been lifted, like a new journey had just begun. As the door closed behind him, she stood there looking out at the quiet street. She thought of Tommy, Anita, and James, of the cracks in the wall of her prejudice. James's words, "Change is something you have to live," echoed in her, a reminder that this was only the beginning. She didn't know where she would go next, but she felt ready to move for the first time, not for anyone else, but for herself. Eleanor Brooks stepped into the community center hall, where the smell of roast beef and cheerful chatter filled the air. The neighborhood's monthly fundraiser, with its long banquet tables and impassioned speeches, wasn't where Eleanor typically appeared. But ever since her conversation with James Carter in her living room the previous week, she'd felt a new pull, a need to show up, to do something more than sit in the quiet of her house. She wore a beige sweater and a long gray skirt, her silver hair neatly combed, but her eyes carried a new resolve, though still edged with hesitation. The hall was crowded with round tables covered in white cloths and banners urging donations hanging from the walls. Eleanor found a spot near the refreshment table where she could observe without drawing too much attention. She recognized a few familiar faces: Clara from the library and Mr. Harold from the neighborhood council. But she kept her distance, not yet ready for idle conversation. Her gaze scanned the room and landed on James Carter. He stood near a banquet table, dressed in a dark blue shirt and slacks, helping an older woman with a cane retrieve a plate of food. His natural and unshowy kindness made Eleanor smile softly, but it also reminded her of all the times she had misjudged him. "Mr. Carter," A loud voice broke through the din. Mr. Harold, the event's organizer, strode over with a clipboard in hand, eyes fixed on his list. "Could you move those chairs in the corner? We need space to add another table." His voice wasn't malicious, but it carried the weight of assumption, as if asking James to handle setup work was only natural. Eleanor froze, her breath catching. She saw eyes glance toward James, some whispering, others turning away to avoid getting involved. James paused, set down the plate of food, and looked up, his expression calm, unhurried. "Actually," he said, his voice deep and clear, "I was invited to speak today." Harold looked up, eyes widening, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, I just thought—" His voice faltered, trailing off in embarrassment. The air in the room turned heavy, as if everyone were waiting to see what would happen next. Eleanor felt heat rise to her face, not out of shame for herself, but because she recognized this moment too well. She had been Harold once, making assumptions about James solely because of his skin color. But now, she couldn't stay silent. A small fire kindled by her apology the week before James's kindness and her falling out with Susan began to burn in her. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, stepping forward, her voice ringing with quiet firmness, cutting through the tension. She stood between Harold and James, her gaze steady, even as her heart pounded. "That wasn't okay, Harold. You made an assumption just like I once did. And I was wrong. So are you." Her words fell into the silence, sharp and clear. The room was quiet. Some people turned to look. Others stared down at their plates to avoid her eyes. Harold blinked, mouth slightly open, unsure what to say. I didn't mean—" he stammered, but Eleanor raised her hand, stopping him. "We don't mean to. That's the problem," she said, her voice low but full of weight. "We speak, we act, without seeing the person right in front of us for who they are." She turned to look at James. His eyes met hers, not surprised, but deep, as if he saw something new in her. No one clapped. No one spoke up in support. A few people whispered. A few judgmental eyes turned toward her. But Eleanor stood tall, her shoulders no longer trembling. She felt a strange freedom, like she had shrugged off a heavy coat she'd worn for too long. Harold mumbled an unclear apology and quickly walked away. The room slowly returned to its chatter, though tension still lingered slightly. James stepped closer to Eleanor, his voice soft. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his eyes sincere. "Yes, I did," Eleanor replied, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Not for you. For me." They stood there a moment longer, no more words needed. Eleanor could feel the eyes of others on her, the judgment, the curiosity, but for the first time, she didn't care. She thought of Tommy and Anita, and always stayed silent when she should have spoken up. She thought of James, how he had shown her that change isn't just words, it's action. When the event ended, she stepped outside. The cold Chicago air hit her face, but she didn't feel it. She felt lighter, like she had drawn a line in her life story. She walked home, the road littered with fallen golden leaves. She knew today's actions would have consequences. Whispers, wary glances from neighbors, maybe even further distance from people like Susan. But she wasn't afraid. She had chosen to stand up not for applause, but so she could look in the mirror and see someone new, someone no longer imprisoned by prejudice. She thought of James, of the recognition in his eyes, and knew this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. She was still learning how to walk a firmer step forward on the road. Eleanor Brooks stood beside the folding table at the community food pantry, slowly arranging cans of beans and packs of pasta into neat rows. The flickering fluorescent lights of the old storeroom caught the silver strands in her hair, but her eyes gleamed with a new sense of focus. It had been 3 weeks since the fundraiser, when she had stood up publicly for James Carter after Harold's false assumption. That act, small as it may have seemed, had reshaped how she saw herself, but it had also sent ripples through the community around her. She was no longer the invisible woman, quietly living in her tidy suburban Chicago home. Now she was the woman people whispered about as she walked by. She had heard the murmurs in the library hallway and felt the sideways glances in the supermarket parking lot. Susan, her closest friend for over 30 years, hadn't called since their argument about James. Some neighbors who used to greet her with polite smiles now offered only curt nods or avoided her gaze altogether. Eleanor knew what they said, that she was changing, that she was stirring things up, and that someone her age shouldn't be so dramatic. But she didn't care, or she tried not to. Every can of beans she placed on the shelf was an affirmation she was here not to prove anything to them, but to live truthfully with herself. "You sure about this?" a voice asked beside her. Eleanor turned to see Clara, a longtime volunteer at the pantry, watching her with curiosity and doubt. Clara, with her dyed red curls and direct tone, wasn't easily convinced of anything. "I mean, you've been showing up every week since that scene at the fundraiser," Clara said. "Some folks think you're just putting on a show or trying to make up for something." Eleanor paused, meeting Clara's gaze without flinching. "I'm here because I want to be," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They can say what they want." Clara raised an eyebrow, but didn't reply. She turned back to her task. Eleanor resumed stacking cans, but Clara's words lingered. She knew her actions at the fundraiser had put her in the spotlight, and not in a flattering way. Some other volunteers, like Mrs. Margaret from the neighborhood council, had grown distant, as if Eleanor's presence reminded them of assumptions they weren't ready to confront. But Eleanor had no regrets. She thought of James, the recognition in his eyes when she spoke up, and the words he had shared in her living room. Change is something you have to live. She was trying to live it day by day. James walked by, clipboard in hand, checking inventory. Their eyes met briefly. A quiet nod served as their greeting. No words were needed. His presence alone was a gentle reminder that she wasn't alone, even if only in small, unspoken ways. Later, when most had gone home, Eleanor noticed James standing by the exit, reorganizing donation boxes. She walked over, unsure what to say, but feeling the need to say something. "You're still here," she said softly. "Every week, no matter what." James smiled his familiar, understated smile. "My mother's the reason," he replied in a low voice. "She fought for civil rights back in the 60s. I endured all kinds of hate just to be treated like a person. She taught me patience, that change doesn't come from grand battles, but from small things, like being here helping one person at a time." He paused, looking at her. "She also told me not everyone changes, but when they do, it's worth waiting for." Eleanor felt warmth rise in her chest, not from flattery, but from seeing a part of James she hadn't known. He wasn't just kind. He carried a legacy. She nodded, but didn't answer right away. She thought of her father and the divisive lessons he'd left behind. She thought of Tommy, Anita, and the chances she'd missed because of fear. But now, here she was, stacking cans of beans, listening to stories, and trying to see the world through new eyes. "I'm not doing this to make up for the past," she said, her voice low but clear. "I'm doing it because I want to feel good when I look in the mirror." James nodded, his eyes understanding. "That's the only reason that lasts," he said, then returned to his task. Eleanor stood there momentarily watching him, not with admiration, but with newfound clarity. She wasn't here for James or Clara or anyone else. She was here because she wanted to become a better version of herself, even if that meant losing people like Susan or facing the quiet judgment of others. She left the pantry and stepped onto the leaf-covered street. The Chicago air was biting cold, but she didn't shiver. She thought of the past few weeks when she folded chairs at the library, sorted produce at the food bank, and listened to strangers' stories. Every act was another brick in a new wall, not to divide, but to connect. She knew the road ahead would be long. The whispers wouldn't stop. The isolation might deepen. But for the first time, she felt peace, not because others agreed with her, but because she finally settled with herself. Eleanor Brooks walked along the winding trail in the park, October's golden leaves crackling softly beneath her feet. The Chicago air was sharp and cold, but she felt warm inside her thick wool coat and red scarf. Beside her walked James Carter, his stride easy, hands tucked into his dark navy coat pockets. They started these walks a few weeks ago, after a chance encounter at the community library. What began as brief greetings had evolved into more extended conversations, unforced, undefined, but significant. Today, like every Thursday, they walked side by side, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed down to join them. They didn't speak for several minutes, letting the wind and rustling leaves fill the silence. But the quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was safe, a space where both could be. Eleanor looked up at the bare branches above, thinking about how she used to fear silence, which she used to fill with judgment and assumptions. Now she found peace in it, especially with James. She glanced over and saw him watching a squirrel dart across the path, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "Did you ever think you'd be here?" she asked, voice low but curious. "I mean, walking with someone like me, after everything." James turned to her, his eyes lit with a calm warmth, not a trace of judgment. "Someone like you," he echoed, his deep voice tinged with gentle teasing. "You mean someone who's trying, or someone who makes me question how patient I am?" Eleanor laughed, a rare sound that surprised even her. "Maybe both," she replied, grateful he didn't shy away from their shared history. James smiled, eyes forward again. "I don't think much about where I'd be," he said. "My mother taught me to live in the present. Do what's right, and let the rest unfold." Eleanor nodded, thinking of his mother, the woman who had fought for civil rights, who had passed down to James, the patience and kindness she now witnessed. She thought of her father, the divisive lessons he left behind, and how she had begun choosing a different path. "I used to think I had to live a certain way," she said slowly, choosing her words. "To be proper, in control, to keep everything separate. But now I want to be known, to be seen, not through what I once believed, but through what I'm becoming." James stopped near a wooden bench beneath a large oak tree and motioned for her to sit. They sat there, breaths forming mist in the crisp air. He watched a young couple tossing a ball to their dog near the fountain. "You let go of the performance," he said softly. "That's the hardest part, letting go of who you think you must be, and just being who you are. Not everyone dares to do that." Eleanor looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't respond immediately, letting his voice settle into her like a stone dropped into still water. They continued talking about little things that somehow mattered. James told her about the small garden he was tending, how his tomato plants kept dying no matter what he did. Eleanor laughed and shared how her third lavender plant was still alive after she learned not to overwater it. "Third time's the charm," she said. "Or maybe James offered you just learned patience." These stories, simple, honest, felt like bricks in a bridge forming between them. Not a bridge of romance, not yet, but one of understanding, of presence. Eleanor thought about the past few weeks, about seeing James at community events, sharing meals with volunteers, exchanging quiet smiles and nods. She thought about how she had once lived, shut away in her home behind walls of judgment that shielded her from the world. And now she was walking beside James, laughing about plants and feeling alive. Truly alive. Not to make amends, not for James. But she wanted to be a new version of Eleanor, one who no longer feared opening her heart. As they stood to continue walking, Eleanor looked at James, her gaze softer. "I don't know where this is going," she said, quiet but sincere. "But I know I want to be here right now." James nodded, his eyes gentle. "Peace is a quiet thing, Ms. Brooks," he said, "but not everyone's brave enough to stay in the silence long enough to find it." They walked on their shoulders, not touching, but their closeness was real, a silent promise unspoken. Eleanor felt a lightness spreading through her, not because she had all the answers, but because she no longer feared the questions. She thought of Tommy and Nita, and the times she'd stayed silent, and of James, who had helped her see that change was possible. She wasn't in love, not exactly, but she was present. She was herself. And for someone who had lived behind walls for so long, that was a beginning strong enough to feel the heartbeat of a soul learning to open. The wooden porch beneath Eleanor Brooks creaked softly under the amber light of sunset as the sun dipped behind a row of crimson maple trees in the suburbs of Chicago. She sat on the extended bench, hands wrapped around a cold ceramic cup, the faint scent of sweet lemon tea lingering. The October air carried a crisp chill, but she didn't mind. Instead, she felt a strange warmth, not from the scarf draped over her shoulders, but from the presence of James Carter beside her. He sat at ease, one arm resting along the back of the bench, the other on his thigh, his gaze fixed on the horizon where dusk was slowly turning violet. They didn't speak much, but their silence was in harmony, like a wordless melody both understood. Eleanor looked out at the empty street, where golden leaves drifted slowly to the ground, catching the last light of day. She thought about the journey that brought her here, from the days she stood behind windows, judging an interracial couple, to the painful moments of confronting her prejudice through James. She remembered their first meeting at the library when she rejected his help on reflex, the time she mistook him for a janitor at the luncheon, and how the shame awakened her. The time she apologized in her living room, heart trembling but sincere, and the moment she stood up for him despite the judging eyes around her. Each step had been a brick dismantled from the wall of bias she had built, and now she sat no longer imprisoned by her past. "I used to think change wasn't for people like me," she said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the peace around them. "Too old, stubborn, proud to admit I was wrong." She paused, looking down at her teacup, running her fingers along its cool ceramic edge. James turned to her, his gaze gentle but silent. He let her speak as he always did. "I wasted a lot of time," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But not all of it. Not now." James looked toward the fading horizon. "Sometimes the final chapters are the ones worth reading again," he said, his voice steady and low. His words weren't meant to comfort, they were a quiet truth, the kind he always offered. Eleanor turned toward him, the corner of her mouth lifting not quite a smile, but close. She thought of his mother, the civil rights fighter who had passed down patience and belief in goodness. She thought of her father, the divisive lessons he left behind, and how she had slowly begun to release them. "I never expected any of this," she said softly. "Not you. Not any of it." She looked at him, her eyes tender, no longer the eyes of a woman folded against the world. James smiled, a quiet brightness in his gaze. "You didn't need to expect it," he replied. "You just needed to be ready to see it." His words swept through her like a breeze dissolving the last remnants of doubt. Eleanor reached out slowly and laid her hand gently atop his on the bench. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a world to her. Her hand, thin, wrinkled by time, rested there, without gripping, merely present. James didn't pull away, nor did he grasp her hand. He let it be, just as he had always allowed her to be herself. That light yet grounded contact was a quiet affirmation that she had crossed the wall, not just of prejudice, loneliness, and fear. She felt her heart settle not in passion, but in peace, a kind she had never known. The sun disappeared, leaving behind a sky of deep violet. There was no soundtrack, no dramatic crescendo, only the wind, the soft hum of insects, and the steady breaths of two people who had found each other, not through grand declarations, but through small, sincere steps. Eleanor thought of Tommy and Anita, and the time she had stayed silent, and of James, who had helped her learn to speak to live. She thought of the walks in the park, the stories about tomato plants and lavender, the silent nods at the food pantry. Every moment was now a part of her, a part of the woman sitting here, not reclaiming the past, but choosing to begin again. "I don't know how much time we have," she whispered, "but I know I want to live it. Live it with open eyes and an open heart." James nodded, his gaze tender. "That's enough," he said. "That's all we ever need." They sat there in the fading light of dusk without needing to say more. Eleanor felt something whole inside, not because she had gained everything, but because she had learned how to begin. How can we believe that each day is a new chance to live better? She looked at the road, now cloaked in twilight, and smiled. The wall of prejudice had crumbled, leaving open space to build a new life, not as a naive young girl dreaming, but as a woman who had chosen to love, to connect, and to live honestly. With James beside her, she knew this wasn't an ending, but a new beginning, one she would walk step by step, with a heart no longer afraid.